the November 2021 work session of the Portland City Council. Today we're convening
recording in progress.
A council work session on the city's draft 2022 federal legislative and regulatory agenda, as well as our draft 2022 state legislative agenda. The Office of Government Relations is here to explain the impacts of redistricting in Oregon, to share some of the dynamics and the political trends that we're currently seeing in Oregon, as well as in Washington, D.C. And then, of course, they're going to provide recommendations for the city's federal and state priorities in 2022. And so without further ado, I'll turn this over to Director Bree Fraley to lead us through today's work session. Good morning, Bree. How are you today?
Good morning, Mayor. I'm doing well. Thank you very much. And good morning to the commissioners as well. I'm happy to be here today. For the record, my name is Brianna Fraley. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of the Office of Government Relations. I'm honored to be here with you all today to present a recommendation on the draft federal and state legislative agendas for 2022. Setting the stage for this morning's work session, we are pleased to share with you updates from Washington, D.C. and Salem, the current status of redistricting, accomplishments from the 2021 work we've done, and the proposed draft federal legislative and regulatory agenda for the second session of the 117th Congress, and the concise and strategic draft legislative agenda for the state's 2022 short session. Our team has tailored the respective agendas to meet the needs of landscapes in Washington, D.C. and Salem, respectively. The draft federal agenda promotes the values of Portland and details the work plan for our federal program in the next year of the second session of a Congress narrowly controlled by Democrats. While the draft state agenda is cognizant of the intent of the short session we are about to enter on the heels of a gubernatorial election year. The foundation of our approach is backed by the city core values, particularly setting an agenda with equitable outcomes and systems changes to promote anti-racism. Taking the lead, your lead, we focused on the unified priorities that were adopted by Council at the beginning of this year to create a path forward for recovery of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our office viewed this as an opportunity to leverage the unified voice and carry it into our agenda development. Houselessness and housing stabilization, community safety, and economic recovery and prosperity are the cornerstones of this next year's agenda. In addition to the above themes, and in a Portland fashion, stewardship of the environment through climate and environmental justice, and lastly, a perennial item that is a staple for local government, protecting and enhancing local authority. Next slide, please. Thank you, Haley. The format for today's discussion will include a presentation by Asena Johnbaz Lawrence, our equity manager, where she will share our approach to the agenda development that is rooted in the citywide core values. A report out on the 2020 Census redistricting by Deputy Director Dan Eisenweis, and an update on activities in Washington, D.C. by our longtime partner and advocate in Washington, D.C., Victoria Cram. A review of the proposed draft federal legislative and regulatory agenda by Niels Tillstrom, our federal relations manager. Then we will move to the state legislature update and review of the draft 2022 state agenda presented by Stacey Cowan, state relations manager, and Eric Knoll, state lobbyist. As well as Stone Hudson in the background is our tribal relations associate who will be taking notes of today's session. We will use the PowerPoint slides to guide our conversations. The slides will be shared with your offices post-work session. I would like to thank Haley Tortorella, our associate in the office, for running our slides this morning. Mayor and commissioners, you have electronic copies of the draft before you. Please note, we have reserved a few minutes between the federal and state agenda presentations for discussion, but please feel free to interrupt and ask questions as we go. I would like to take a minute to thank Council office staff and Bureau legislative liaisons for their hard work in the preparation of these drafts before you today, as well as the ongoing collaboration we enjoy with your teams year-round. Thank you for your time today and your investment into our shared core values and priorities. I look forward to the work session and opportunities that lie ahead of us in 2022. I will now hand it over to Asena John-Blas Lawrence. Chuchaninla.
I think she's on mute.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Director Fraley. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Asena John-Blas Lawrence, and my pronouns are she, her. I am the Small Bureau's Equity Manager at the Office of Equity and Human Rights and serve as the Equity Manager to the Office of Government Relations. Today, I'll briefly discuss how equity is grounded within the Office of Government Relations work, including in our federal and state legislative agendas. As we know, in 2020, you, our Portland City Council, unanimously adopted 6 core values, which guides our work at the City of Portland as an institution, the work done within each bureau and office, and the work of every city employee. These values, equity, anti-racism, transparency, communication, collaboration, and fiscal responsibility, are intended to be developed competencies and associated behaviors that guides our actions as we conduct our work, engage our workforce, and serve our communities and our partners. Our core values also complements our citywide equity goals and strategies. The Office of Government Relations holds these values as our core responsibilities in our work in advocating to our federal and state governments and in working with our partners on behalf of the city and on behalf of our communities. Haley, next slide, please. Thank you. A small example of advocacy over the last year at the federal and state levels have included: you, our Portland City Council, joined a coalition of electeds from many states in demanding multiple federal immigration reforms to then President-elect Biden. The city worked to introduce Senate Bill 398, which bans the display of a noose for the purpose of harassment or intimidation. It passed. And the city worked in coalition to support House Bill 3265, which updates the Sanctuary Promise Act to protect immigrant and refugee communities and prioritize real public safety, keeping local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities separate. That also passed. For the development of the 2022 draft agendas, Government Relations sent issue identification forms to each office and bureau earlier this fall, which stated and set a precedent that through our advocacy, the City of Portland is committed to centering racial and disability equity, ensuring that existing inequities are not exacerbated, and working to repair past harms. It also asked bureaus to answer questions about how their proposals improved racial equity and met our citywide equity goals and strategies. That language is reflected in these draft agendas, and equity-centered issue items were prioritized, which you will hear about shortly. As we're all collectively striving for the City of Portland to be an anti-racist institution, one of the ways in which we can further that is through our advocacy efforts at the federal and state levels on behalf of our communities. So with that, I'll pass it to my colleague, Dan Eisenbeis.
Thank you, Asena. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and members of council. My name is Dan Eisenbeis. I use he, him pronouns and am the Deputy Director and Regional Liaison in the Office of Government Relations. Before we move into discussion of the draft federal and state legislative agendas, I will provide an update on legislative and congressional redistricting in Oregon and how changes will affect the districts representing Portland. Redistricting will help set the context for the legislative and congressional sessions next year, with primary and general election races in 2022 based on the new districts for terms beginning in 2023. My colleagues Vicki Cram and Eric Knoll will also respectively speak in more detail later about federal and state election year dynamics. First, an update on state legislative redistricting. As you will recall, the legislature passed a legislative redistricting plan during its late September special session, and the plan was signed by the governor. The plan was subsequently the subject of 2 different legal appeals. However, just last week, the Oregon Supreme Court issued a ruling dismissing both appeals. The redistricting plan is now considered final and will take effect January 1st for legislative races next year. Next slide, please. The The legislative redistricting process in Oregon is technically a reapportionment process to ensure that the state's population as determined in the decennial US Census is equally distributed in the 60 House districts and 30 Senate districts. This map shows the population balance from the 2020 census in the existing 2010 Oregon House districts. Orange shows 2010 districts with populations above average, that is, too many people based on the 2020 census results. Purple shows districts with populations below average, or too few people based on the 2020 census results. Essentially, this map shows which areas of the state grew faster than average since 2010, the orange areas, or grew slower than average, the purple areas. Notably, certain districts in Northwest Portland, Washington County, and Deschutes County had the highest growth. Districts including downtown Portland, inner Northeast Portland, Happy Valley, and Salem had higher than average growth. Meanwhile, certain districts in Eastern and Southern Oregon had the lowest growth. To a large extent, these population trends drive changes in district boundaries. Next slide, please. In Portland specifically, the overall size of the legislative delegation after redistricting will be similar to today. However, certain boundaries will shift significantly, affecting the composition of Portland's delegation and the relative proportion of the city that is included in key districts. Some of the biggest shifts in district boundaries are on the west side and in outer southeast Portland, respectively. These changes are most clearly seen in the Senate. In this map of existing 2010 Senate boundaries, I want to draw your attention to Senate District 16 in the upper right or northwest portion of the map, and then moving south to Districts 17, 14, 18, and 19, which include portions of Portland and also large areas outside the city. Also in Southeast Portland, note the hourglass-shaped Senate District 24 and adjacent District 26, which extends east to Hood River County. Next slide. In the 2020 map, we see consolidation of districts to include larger portions of Northwest and Southwest Portland, and substantial shift in the districts representing outer Southeast Portland. In Northwest Portland, Senate District 16, currently represented by Betsy Johnson, will shift entirely outside of the city. Senate District 17, currently represented by Deputy Majority Leader and Ways and Means Co-Chair Elizabeth Steiner Hayward, will go from representing portions of the Pearl District in Northwest Portland to representing most of downtown, the Pearl District, Linton, and parts of St. John's. Senate District 14, currently represented by Assistant Majority Leader Kate Lieber, and including very small portions of Southwest Portland, will shift to include much of Southwest Portland, including Portland State University, Lair Hill, Multnomah Village, and Hillsdale. Meanwhile, Senate District 18, previously represented by Jenny Burdick, will shift entirely outside of Portland. Yesterday, former Representative Akasha Lawrence Spence was appointed to fill the Senate District 18 vacancy through the end of 2022. An election will also be held next year to represent the district based on its new location in Washington County in 2023. The boundary of Senate District 19, currently represented by Majority Leader Rob Wagner, will also shift northward to include Johns Landing and South Waterfront as far north as the Ross Island Bridge. In Southeast Portland, District 24, currently represented by Senator Casey Jama, will shift east to include nearly all of outer Southeast Portland. District 26, currently represented by the only Republican member of the Portland Legislative Delegation, Chuck Thompson, who is retiring, will shift entirely outside of Portland. And District 20, currently represented by Bill Kennemer, will shift north to include small areas of outer Southeast Portland. Next slide. Similar to the Senate changes, a number of existing 2010 districts will shift entirely outside of the city of Portland, including District 31 in Northwest Portland, currently represented by Brad Witt, who is retiring. District 35 in Southwest Portland, currently represented by Dasha Graber, who will reside in the new District 28. District 36 in Southwest Portland, currently represented by Lisa Reynolds, who is moving and plans to run in the new District 34. And House District 51 in Southeast Portland, currently represented by Janelle Bynum. Next slide. On the 2020 House district map, you can see the aforementioned new District 28 in Southwest Portland will significantly overlap with the area currently in District 35. District 48, currently represented by Jeff Reardon, who is retiring, will shift eastward to include the outer Southeast Portland area in the current District 51. Like Senate District 20, the new House District 39 will shift substantially north to include small areas of outer Southeast Portland. Representative Janelle Bynum has indicated she will run for the seat. So again, the overall size of the Portland legislative delegation will be about the same after redistricting as it is today. However, redistricting will affect the relative representation of Portland by certain individual legislators, including current and potential future members of legislative leadership. Eric Knoll will elaborate on this topic a bit more later. Next slide. Now I would like to turn to congressional redistricting in Oregon, which this year has been especially important because, as anticipated, Oregon was awarded a 6th seat in the reapportionment process resulting from the 2020 census.
Dan, could I ask you a question? And it's totally an unfair one, so I acknowledge that right up front. So feel free to tell me to stuff it. But as you look at the redistricting here, both on the Senate side and on the House side, is there anything in that redistricting that catches your attention as something we need to be aware of as city commissioners, either positive leveraging opportunities or concern on the negative side that some shift in those districts might impact our ability to conduct business in Salem? Is there anything like that that pops for you?
Well, I think certainly in the near term, and I would invite my state relations colleagues to chime on this either now or later as well. As I mentioned, some of the districts on the west side where there's consolidation of the relative proportion of the city of Portland in certain districts presents certain opportunities. So as I mentioned, Senator Steiner Hayward's district will include substantially more of the city of Portland in her district. She is in a key position in the legislature as the co-chair of the Ways and Means Committee on the Senate side. So that would be an example of the kind of opportunity that is presented. As the state relations team will elaborate later, we are also anticipating after the short session that there will be substantial turnover in the legislature and amongst legislative leadership. So exactly how things play out looking farther out to 2023 remains to be seen.
All right, and I'd just like to put a marker out there now. We do the legislative breakfast every session, and that's fun, and I would encourage us to continue to do it just because people enjoy it. It's an opportunity to share, and I'm told by legislators that sometimes it's the first real opportunity for them to hear what their colleagues are prioritizing in the legislative session. But I'd also like us to be a little more strategic in terms of one-on-one relationships. Let's try and stay ahead of the curve in terms of who we believe will be shaping legislation, who our key allies are, and in fact, who are our key opponents that maybe we need to sit down with as well and either build or improve upon our relationships with those individuals. You know, it's all about relationships down there. And I want to make sure we go into this session in a strong position because we have a lot of asks.
Thank you for that, Mayor. We absolutely want to engage you and the other members of council in those direct conversations with legislators.
Good, thank you. And I know we're talking about the Portland area representation, but I know that as you get to our agenda, our fate is also in the hands of people who live far, far from the city of Portland. And I want to make sure that we're doing a good baseline assessment of who we need to meet where. One thing I used to do that I haven't done in a long time is I used to go to people's districts. I used to go far afield, as far east as the eastern border of this state to try and build allyship for legislation that I needed passed. And I don't think we should take that off the table as an option. There's 5 of us, we've got relationships. we should be working the traps across the aisle as well as within the Portland area to try to get done what we need done. And I need your help to identify those players.
And I think we absolutely agree. And that kind of in-district statewide outreach is something that staff in our office has traditionally done as well. Obviously, our ability to do that in person has been curtailed by the pandemic, but outreach is still very high on our list, both in the interim and during session, of course.
And I will just weigh in and say, I support the legislative breakfast because we learn a lot about what the priorities are of our legislative delegation. And so I certainly hope we're able to do that in January, as we traditionally do. I guess my question is that we know that there's going to be significant opportunities. Let me just speak for me around transportation in this upcoming, in the next year, both at the federal and at the state level. And for me, it's really important that we are strategic about making sure that our transportation needs are prioritized in Salem. As you guys know, ODOT is the big elephant in the room, and they don't move very effectively. And so any advice that you can give as we move forward about where I can weigh in to make sure that the transportation decisions we are making are consistent with the City of Portland's values around climate mitigation and reducing auto emissions.
Commissioner Hardesty, thank you for flagging that. I would recommend that we bookmark that as an item of interest that we perhaps revisit in the context of the discussions about the federal and state legislative agendas, respectively.
Thank you.
So turning to congressional redistricting, as you know, this was particularly important this year because Oregon was awarded a 6th congressional seat in the reapportionment process resulting from the 2020 census. This, of course, comes in the context of a narrowly divided Congress. The Congressional Redistricting Plan passed by the legislature and signed by the governor was appealed, and just last Wednesday, a special judicial panel appointed by the Oregon Chief Justice issued a unanimous ruling dismissing the petition. Yesterday was the deadline to appeal the panel's decision to the Oregon Supreme Court. And as of this morning, based on the information available in the Supreme Court's online case information database, it appears that a notice of appeal was not filed, in which case the new districts are final. If by chance there has been a delay in the court's record system being updated and an appeal was in fact filed, the Supreme Court would have until January 3rd to issue a decision. And if changes were required, the special panel would then be required to make revisions by January 24th, and the court would review and either approve those revisions or make any additional corrections necessary by February 7th, approximately 1 month before the primary filing deadline. Next slide, please. This map shows the population balance based on 6 districts from the 2020 census in the existing 5 2010 congressional districts. So all of these are over what would be required. Like the map that you saw earlier, shades of orange show the relative degree to which the existing districts exceed the average necessary to balance population equally amongst 6 districts. Again, the highest growth regions of the state were parts of the Portland metropolitan region, Bend, and Salem. Next slide. In the current map, Portland is part of Congressional District 3, represented by Congressman Earl Blumenauer, Congressional District 1, represented by Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, and to a small extent, part of Congressional District 5, represented by Congressman Kurt Schrader. Next slide, please. In the new map, most of Southwest Portland and the Central East Side shift from Congressional District 3 to Congressional District 1. A small area of outer Southeast Portland shifts from CD5 to CD3. And Brentwood, Darlington, the southern portions of Eastmoreland and Sellwood, and a portion of Southwest Portland shift from CD3 to CD5. Meanwhile, the new Congressional District 6 includes very small areas of Portland and Washington County. The net effect is that technically 4, and to a substantial extent 3, House districts will include portions of Portland. However, those districts will each include significant other areas as well. CD1 will extend west to the North Coast. CD3 will extend farther east than the current district to include Hood River. And CD5 will realign to include the eastern portion of the northern Willamette Valley, Cascades, and Bend. Meanwhile, the new CD6 will also include Salem, McMinnville, and much of the Southwest metro area. Again, the legislative and congressional redistricting changes I have described take effect in 2022 for terms beginning in 2023. I should also note that a state initiative petition has been filed for 2022 that would amend the Constitution to establish a redistricting commission. If that initiative petition were to move forward and be approved by voters, a redistricting commission would be appointed in 2023 to develop new redistricting maps that take effect in 2024. At this point, unless there are additional questions from council, I would like to introduce my esteemed colleague, Vicki Cram.
A quick question. So if a ballot measure would actually create a new redistricting process? I thought the redistricting was a federal thing that had to happen every decade. So explain how a ballot measure could interfere with a redistricting process, if you know, please.
Commissioner Hardesty, as I understand it, the federal process is that Congress in the House, the seats are reapportioned based on the decennial census, and then states are required to conduct redistricting to equally distribute their respective populations as determined by the census in the number of seats that they are apportioned. The manner in which states do that is determined by the states. And so some states like Oregon have a redistricting process that is conducted by the legislature. There are some states that have elected to conduct their redistricting processes through commissions. And then there are some sort of in-between options where there are commissions that essentially produce maps more on an advisory basis that require some sort of sign-off by either the governor or by the legislature. Furthermore, the appeals process is specified in Oregon statute as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For me, my question is really around, so we've just gone through this very painful redistricting process, right? That we're supposed to, in January, redraw the lines and start leading from those new districts, right? But you mentioned there's a ballot measure that has the potential to change that in a couple of years, which is radically different than it changing it the next time we do redistricting.
Correct. The initiative petition that has been filed and would still need to qualify for the ballot by obtaining or gathering a sufficient number of signatures would first create a redistricting commission that would redraw the maps based on the most recent census. And that commission would be appointed in 2023. And the initiative petition specifies that thereafter, that commission would be appointed on a regular decennial basis following each census.
Thank you. I had not heard that. So that's intriguing to think that we could actually be going down this path. And then 2 years later, oops, how bad, right? We got to start over. It just feels weird.
Are there any other questions or comments before I turn things over to Vicki? Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. It's a pleasure to appear before you today. I'm Vicki Cram, and I'm a principal at Squire Patton Boggs in Washington, D.C. I use she, her pronouns. And along with your excellent federal legislative governmental relations team, I assist in the implementation of the city's federal agenda once it is approved by you in January. Next slide, please, Haley. So this is a slide that reflects the balance of power in the 117th Congress, which is the Congress we're currently in and will be in next year. Control of the US Senate is split 50-50, and Vice President Harris provides a tie-breaking vote. Senate legislative action can be stalled or dramatically altered by a single senator, and two independents caucus with the Democrats. In the House, the Democrats maintain slim control of the House of Representatives. Currently, Democrats have an 8-seat majority, 221 to 213, but 218 votes are required to pass legislation in the House, which means that the Speaker cannot lose more than 3 Democratic votes to pass a bill. And this is why you've seen Democrats really struggle to pass major legislation over the past year. Congressional retirements and changes. There are a number of pending retirements, and others are leaving to seek other offices. And there is also redistricting, as Dan just went through in our case in Oregon. And historical precedent would indicate that the House will switch hands in the next election, which puts a lot of pressure on the Democrats to pass President Biden's legacy legislation this year and early next year. Of course, as we get farther into the year, we have less opportunity to be able to pass legislation due to the pressures of the upcoming election. Next slide, please. This is Oregon's congressional delegation. We have a very seasoned congressional delegation with excellent seniority, and they work very, very hard on our behalf. Senator Ron Wyden, as chair of the Senate Finance Committee, will be key to passing the Build Back Better legislation through the Senate. This is the remaining big priority of the Biden agenda that is the nearly $2 trillion social human infrastructure package, and it contains the child care tax credit, housing as infrastructure, and family and medical leave, as passed by the House, but it needs to pass the Senate, and that's why he will be so important in this. Senator Jeff Merkley serves on the Appropriations Committee. This year, the Democrats reinstituted congressionally directed spending. The city will be working closely with the senator to funnel funding towards the city of Portland's priorities. Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici serves on the Education and Workforce Committee, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and the very important Select Committee on Climate Crisis. Congressman Cliff Bentz, who has the least seniority, having been recently elected, serves on the Natural Resources Committee and the Judiciary Committee. Congressman Earl Blumenauer serves on the Ways and Means Committee. This is the very powerful Tax Rating Committee, which is why Congressman Blumenauer only serves on one committee. Congressman Peter DeFazio, of course, is chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and crafted passage of the bipartisan infrastructure package and will have oversight over its implementation by the Biden administration. Congressman Kurt Schrader serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee, another very powerful committee with a very broad portfolio, and it will be key in the oversight of the implementation of the broadband provisions of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. Next slide, please. So these are some key budget dates. The federal fiscal year is 2022. That began on October 1st of this year. And as you can see from the slide, there are a lot of issues that are pending before the end of this calendar year. One of the first is that according to the Treasury Secretary, the debt ceiling is likely to expire in mid-December next month, 2021. This is a critical fiscal deadline, which if not met, could result in the federal government defaulting with catastrophic economic consequences. As you will recall, in October, lawmakers reached an 11th hour agreement to raise the debt ceiling until December, but only after weeks and weeks of political brinksmanship. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has demanded that Democrats address the debt ceiling on their own, but recently the rhetoric has been toned down and he has held private talks with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to discuss moving forward on the debt limit. The current continuing resolution is funding the federal government right now at FY21 levels due to the failure of Congress to pass any of the FY22 appropriations bills. So the continuing resolution is set to expire on Friday at midnight, December 3rd, and a short-term continuing resolution is possible, maybe into January, which is where the Democrats want to take it, but the Republicans want to go into February, March. So that's being discussed actually as I speak right now. And the House could vote as soon as tomorrow on another continuing resolution to carry the federal government and keep it open. The House passed in November the Build Back Better reconciliation package, and Senate Majority Leader Schumer is hopeful the Senate will complete consideration by Christmas. I think this is optimistic, but that's the goal. And given that 2022 includes midterm elections, we also expect that Congress will consider a significant amount of messaging legislation over the coming year that will likely not become law, but will just provide the platform for Democrats in particular, but also Republicans to run in the midterm elections. With Congress consumed by these midterm elections, action will be concentrated on the administration next year, particularly implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was signed into law earlier this month. For Commissioner Hardesty, we just discussed that briefly with Dan. This was signed into law this month, and we are following the implementation very closely for the city and flagging competitive funding opportunities to align with a variety of city projects. And then potentially there would be implementation of Build Back Better Act if it gets passed by the Senate, and then would have to go back to the House again as well. But that could potentially be a big focus of next year, is the implementation of that legislation. Next slide, please. Key federal 2021 accomplishments this year. This past year was an intense and frenetic year as the new Biden administration and new democratically controlled Congress responded to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and resulting economic fallout, while also pursuing a transformative agenda of infrastructure investments along with anti-poverty and social investments. The city of Portland engaged early on with the new administration, the new Congress, and with our congressional delegation to pursue and to align our priorities. There was remarkably quick and largely bipartisan action early on the American Rescue Plan to address the pandemic. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was the second leg of the legislative stool, which was signed into law this month. Still pending is the third element, the nearly $2 trillion Build Back Better legislation, which has passed the House, but still has a long way to go in passing the Senate. The Build Back Better bill faces significant hurdles with senators, in particular Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who doesn't like the overall price tag of the bill, worries it will exacerbate inflation, and disagrees with some of the policy provisions, such as the paid family and medical leave. The bill also faces procedural hurdles in the Senate, where it must pass through the arcane reconciliation process in order to avoid a filibuster. Every Democratic senator must vote for it to pass. So let me go through a couple of the highlights in these bills. The American Rescue Plan was the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that passed at the height of the pandemic in March. It contained the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. That was $350 billion nationwide, of which Portland received $208 million in two installments, one this year, and we will receive one early next year. It also contained the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which was $24.5 billion nationwide, of which Portland got $25 million approximately. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the $1.2 trillion bipartisan package signed into law this month, it contains $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging and fueling infrastructure, the Reconnecting Communities pilot program, which is a $1 billion equity-focused pilot program for reconstruction of streets and parks and neighborhoods, The Healthy Streets program, which is $100 million to expand tree cover and deploy cool and porous pavements, and the Broadband Equity Funding, which is $42 billion to states for access to and deployment of broadband. The Build Back Better bill, which again was the House passed bill, but still has to go through the Senate, contains the very important $150 billion for affordable housing investment, including expansion of the low-income housing tax credit. This was supposed to be in the infrastructure bill, but dropped out. It's now in the Build Back Better bill. It also contains a $2.5 billion fund for community-based violence intervention initiatives. And then finally, lastly, the annual 2022 appropriations process. As I mentioned, for the first time in over 10 years, the Democrats reinstituted the practice of steering funds to local projects. Thus far, the city of Portland has received community-directed spending for the following 2 projects. One is a joint city Multnomah County project request for $2.65 million for a behavioral health resource center. And then we also have received $732,000 for Tryon Creek culvert replacement. But as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, the FY22 appropriations process is not yet concluded and has ways to go before we know whether these projects will stay in and will be funded. I'm happy to take any questions, but if there are none, I will turn it over to Niels Tillstrom, my colleague, to walk through the draft federal agenda.
Yeah, I have my hand up, so thank you.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Commissioner.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. And thank you, Bree, for your leadership. I want to speak to the ARPA funds that we are spending and allocating at this time. I wanted to think out loud with all of you on how do we communicate to our delegation how we're doing with the investments that we receive. So how can we work with you to steward them for their good work and have a boilerplate for a dashboard that shows what we're doing with the investments and how it's making a difference locally. I just don't know if we have anything like that. So I'm really speaking to all of you on how we can be helpful with our offices to work with all of you so that we can steward our delegation and show what these great investments are doing here on the ground.
Well, I'm happy to take a first stab at that. And then if Niels or Bree wants to jump in, the city has a great sort of dashboard on your website, which I review periodically, which I think is very, very helpful. We also have to make monthly and quarterly reporting to the Treasury Department on the use of these funds. I sort of hearken back to the American Recovery Plan, and I think this would be true of the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. I think, putting up a sign literally that sort of says this was funded by this piece of legislation is very, very helpful. But I also think that we could provide additional briefings to our delegation on what we're doing with those funds, because it's important for them to know how well the city has decided to use these funds and how it's benefiting the citizens.
Thank you, Vicki and Commissioner Ryan, for the question. This is Bree, and I'll hand it over to Niels shortly. But I just wanted to note that internally within the city, we have an American Rescue Plan team that is responsible for recording and documenting the process. And I wanted to turn a nod and thank the mayor and commissioners for approving last year's budget that included 2 additional FTEs within the Office of Government Relations to specifically advocate for more resources and the implementation of the American Rescue Plan. And we will be bringing on 2 new positions into our office that will do just that, to help tell the story and navigate additional resources for the city of Portland. So just wanted to thank you for your endorsement and support of those positions. They will be the storytellers of our good work that we're doing with those federal dollars. And Niels, I'll hand it over to you for how we can then advocate with our congressional delegation and others.
I have a question before you move on. My question is really around, the Transportation Administration, the Federal Transportation Administration needs to be I need to be close buddies with them. And what I know is that we have some relationships, some deep relationships at the Federal Transportation Administration. And I want to make sure that Oregon gets in front of that administration rather than ODOT being the lead that is actually building relationships with them. So any help you can give me in figuring out what the appropriate opportunities are to actually make sure that we're having direct communication rather than the communication coming through ODOT. Because ODOT and PBOT do not think the same when it comes to transportation infrastructure.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. We will absolutely work with getting the City of Portland and PBOT in front of the Transportation Secretary in this coming year and find ways to build those partnerships with the new administration that Biden has put together.
I think that's going to be vital for us to actually get our needs met here. Appreciate that.
And Niels.
Thank you. My name is Niels Tillstrom. I'm the Federal Relations Manager. I was going to answer Commissioner Ryan's question real quick, and speaking with the delegation on how we've been using ARP dollars, we have been doing so strategically on an issue by issue basis as we are hitting either milestones or are running into issues that they could help resolve. But to Vicky's point, I think being very bold with discussing how we've been spending these dollars, what we've been spending these dollars on via, either a physical sign like back in the recovery plan, the Obama recovery bill days, or social media now would be an excellent way to do it, just to be very vocal about that and to emphasize their good work.
And when we say affordable housing at the federal level, what are they talking about? What does that mean?
So there are a number of programs that are at the Department of Housing and Urban Development that support the investment of affordable housing, or and either helping through low-income housing tax credits to build more affordable housing or preserve affordable housing. There are a number of programs that we are supportive of that do that kind of work.
I guess my question is really around what we say is affordable at 80% of MFI is nowhere near affordable. So I'm just curious if the federal government is really talking affordable housing that people can afford to live in, or if they are stuck at the 80% MFI range, which doesn't provide much affordability for most working people in Portland. That's a big issue, right? People use the term affordable housing all the time and they don't know what they're talking about because it's really not affordable at all, right? So it's really important that we have real details about when you say affordable, what does that mean? Are we at 60% of MFI? Are we at 80%? Because 80% is not affordable, 60% is. And that's going to matter a lot as this legislation comes through, because I got to tell you, what we get tax breaks for stupid stuff, and it doesn't provide much affordable housing at all. So I hope you'll keep an eye on that and make sure when they say affordable, you ask affordable for who, right? Because that makes a difference. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Haley, next slide, please. Thank you. So good morning, Commissioners and Mayor. Again, my name is Niels Tillstrom, and I use he, him pronouns. I am the Federal Relations Manager in the Office of Government Relations, as I stated previously. And so Vicky has provided you the context and climate for our work on behalf of the city with the federal government. And I'm going to walk you through the highlights of the draft agenda that we are building with your offices and bureaus. And so there are two concepts that frame the draft 2022 agenda. As Vicky previously stated, 2022 will be the second session of the 117th Congress. And given that we will be working within the same power structure, the draft before you carries forward a number of items from the current 2021 agenda that frankly we're still working on. And then also, as stated earlier, we have drafted the agenda to be in alignment with the city's core values and the city-wide racial equity goals and strategies. And the Office of Government Relations is dedicated to partaking in and upholding the city's responsibility in centering racial and disability equity in the city's federal advocacy work. So the draft 2022 federal legislative and regulatory agenda is made up of 7 priorities. And with each of them, we have identified specific opportunities for action and engagement. These priorities are structured to reflect the shared priorities the council adopted in February 2021, addressing houselessness, developing a new model of community safety, and supporting economic recovery. The agenda also addresses the priorities of racial justice, climate and environmental justice, infrastructure investment, and maintaining local authority and opposing preemption. The agenda serves as an outward-facing document to provide the city's position to our congressional delegation and to the Biden administration, but it also serves as a consensus work plan that council approves and allows the federal program to move nimbly in response to the great number of opportunities and requests at the national and federal level. So as I'm going through the draft agenda priorities, please note that we've identified, with the help of your staff and bureau liaisons and subject matter experts, over 60 opportunities for action and engagement that fit under the 7 priorities. So we have sent you and your offices drafts that cover all of these items. However, during this presentation, I will only be hitting the highlights for time. I'm happy to answer questions on any of the items contained in the document. So the first priority, next slide, please, is addressing houselessness and housing stability. Meeting the needs of those experiencing houselessness and lack of access to affordable housing and safe housing is a priority for the city of Portland. And our work spans beyond funding for the essential federal affordable housing programs and rental assistance into tackling the root causes of an individual's houselessness, including but not limited to access to workforce training, mental health, and behavioral health services. So the areas identified for advocacy and action in this priority are advocating for additional rental assistance, mortgage assistance, and enhanced eviction and foreclosure prevention, emergency solutions grants and continuum of care programs, the community development block grant program, the home investment partnership program, and the housing opportunities for persons living with AIDS programs. It also includes expanding the eligibility of the housing choice voucher entitlement to extremely low income older adults and people living with serious long-term disability status. It also includes the funding for expanded mental health and behavioral health services, the support for Legal Services Corporation and the right to the national right to counsel for renters, as well as updating the federal definition of homelessness to recognize that those living in outdoor alternative sheltering strategies like villages and safe park programs, those who are doubled up in housing currently, or those who are exiting institutional settings like jail, hospital, inpatient treatment, and foster care who do not have stable housing upon exit are also experiencing houselessness. The next priority is community safety and first response. Next slide, please.
Before you move off that,
yes.
I just want to reiterate our efforts to, and this was really germane to the work that Dan's doing, make sure that we are continuing to advocate and create pathways to federal property that is not being utilized to be reallocated or partnered with local jurisdictions as potential shelter sites. And I know Dan's been working with, I think it's the GSA, right, that actually does this on behalf of the federal government on the Sears building. But I'd like to see that formalized, and Senator Wyden seemed very open to that idea, because it's not just a Portland thing. Obviously, this is a national issue and there's a lot of good infrastructure. It's not being utilized nationally.
Thank you, Mayor. Will do. Haley, next slide. Thank you. The next priority is community safety and first response. So the obligation to keep the public safe rests in many hands. The city is advocating for federal funding and policies to develop public safety solutions that best fit the needs for our community and allow for all Portlanders to feel safe. So this means supporting the Portland Street Response Program, also supporting potential public safety reform legislation like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, including the reform of the Qualified Immunity Doctrine, supporting the Urban Area Security Initiative grant program, which provides funding to PBEM, supporting domestic violence intervention and prevention programs, resources for wildland urban interface hazards, requirements for critical energy infrastructure facilities to be seismically sound, the support for FEMA's Assistance to Firefighters grant program, programs that help survivors of sex trafficking, which include culturally specific and trauma-informed services and policies, supporting the community-oriented policing services program and the Burn Justice Assistance Program and other programs, and advocate for improvements to examine changes in hiring practices within police bureaus, and supporting funding for the transition to the next gen 911 system, which would be important to BOEX work.
I had a question about the Portland Street Response. Senator Wyden got a pilot pass that allows other folks who don't have Portland Street Response to create a pilot. But the funding mechanism that is in place for that pilot, and I've had this conversation with Senator Wyden, actually the money would go to the Oregon Health Authority, and they would reimburse using their normal channels, which means that Portland Fire and Rescue would not have access to those dollars. And so just wanted to give you that heads up that though the pilot is fine, any permanent legislation must be able to allow for us to be reimbursed for Portland Street Response from that federal legislation. So just wanted to make sure that you were aware, Niels, that that is still up in the air. I know Senator Wyden is working on it with OHA, but just wanted you to know that.
Thank you, Commissioner. We've been in conversation with his staff and understand that his state director is leading that conversation with OHA.
Yes, she is.
Yeah, thank you. So next slide. The following community safety is economic recovery and prosperity. The City of Portland will advocate for crucial federal resources, policies, and practices to address the economic security and public health needs for all Portlanders while prioritizing the vulnerable populations. Keeping families and individuals housed with food and water, heat, and power through this period of instability is paramount to the well-being and future recovery of Portlanders. The lingering effects of COVID-19 continue to cause far-reaching negative impacts on local and global economies, and significantly harm Portland households and businesses alike. Our advocacy would be centered around continuing the flexibility of federal financial assistance through the COVID-19 recovery bills, supporting the Community Development Block Grant Program. City of Portland uses CDBG dollars both on the housing side and economic development side, so we've mentioned it twice in the agenda. Aligning federal vaccine policy and regulatory framework to fit city policies. Funding to support the city's goals around digital equity and inclusion, supporting the new water and wastewater utility rate program, protecting the tax exempt status of municipal bonds, supporting the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities, supporting legislation for the equitable federal cannabis law and regulations, especially around small businesses, and working with our partners to support the U.S. funding for the USDA food and nutrition service programs, including SNAP. We will also be tracking any opportunities to increase the FEMA federal cost share for ongoing COVID-19 related expenditures. Any questions on this? Next slide, Haley. Thank you. Racial justice is the next priority. The City of Portland is advocating for anti-racist public policy at the federal level to strive for more equitable outcomes for our community members. The city recognizes and acknowledges the impacts of public policy that have led to inequitable outcomes and is actively engaged in evaluating and challenging its own practices, and will advocate for the federal government on several issues, including federal reparations for Black communities and Indigenous communities, striking the punishment clause of the 13th Amendment, supporting the creation of, supporting housing and small business federal anti-displacement policies, supporting the goals of the Community Reinvestment Act, and we will work with our tribal partners to preserve tribal sovereignty and self-governance, and recently began this work in conversation with several tribal leaders at the City of Portland's Tribal Nations Summit. We'll support the Department of Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Truth and Healing Initiative, and strengthen voter protections, including bolstering the Voting Rights Act and designating Election Day as a national holiday, and work with our community partners to support the implementation of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program, and also on the issue of comprehensive immigration reform. Next slide. Climate and environmental justice. The City of Portland recognizes this critical juncture to invest in a swift transition to clean energy while reducing energy costs for low income and the most vulnerable in our communities. This work centers the protection of and well-being of Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color, and builds resilience and stability to withstand future crises. Effective implementation of these goals can only truly be met with intentional and robust federal support and engagement. The city will advocate on the reduction of carbon in the transportation sector, including creating incentives for strong fuel economy and emission standards, clean freight strategies, equitable multimodal investment to encourage mode shift, and an equitable transition for transportation funding away from fossil fuels. We will work to identify opportunities to invest in climate resiliency projects, which could include increasing the urban tree canopy, climate resilience planning, community resilience centers, landslide prevention, flood prevention, wildfire prevention and management, and neighborhood scale energy resilience and green fleet infrastructure. We will also work to support the city's applications to the EPA's Brownfield Remediation Grant Program, the funding for urban parks that serve low-income neighborhoods. We will be working with the Portland Harbor Superfund cleanup team on advocating in the city's leadership position on that issue. We'll be tracking potential reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program. Additionally, we'll be supporting the Bureau of Environmental Services work on renewable energy through renewable natural gas on a number of different programs that Department of Energy has. We'll also be involved in federal environmental rulemaking, as well as conversations around requiring safe transportation of oil by train. The next priority is infrastructure investment, and the city believes a strong federal partner in the investment in infrastructure is essential for the health and safety of the public and environment, as well as the growth of local economies. This priority includes tracking and being involved in the implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to support city interests in meeting safety, equity, climate, and mobility goals. Identifying and supporting funding opportunities for electric vehicle infrastructure throughout the city, especially when it comes to public safety vehicles. Supporting the Small Starts and New Starts program, which included the streetcar and light rail projects. Identifying potential federal assistance for the Broadway Corridor project at Union Station. And supporting the Portland Metropolitan Levy System project. We'll also be identifying funding opportunities for cybersecurity and technology infrastructure investment for BTS, as well as tracking any changes to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And we will also be taking note of conversations around the establishment of high-speed passenger rail in the Pacific Northwest. Any questions? Next slide. Thank you, Haley. And finally, yes.
And Nels, I had a question about, I didn't see anything around moving away from gas taxes to fund transportation projects, right? Changing how we fund that whole process. I know there's a move to move away from gas taxes for transportation into something else. And I don't know what the something else is, but I'm just wondering why that's not on our agenda, because we want to move away from the gas tax as the vehicle to pay for transportation projects.
I agree with you, Commissioner, and I think that I shorthanded it in my comments, and it resides both in the climate and environmental justice agenda or priority, and also transportation. Right. So we just talk about supporting. Sorry, I'm like, there's a screen over my shoulder that has the document. Supporting federal investment and innovation to the transportation sector to reduce carbon emissions, which include creating incentives for fuel economy standards, but also for an equitable transition for the transportation funding away from fossil fuels.
Thank you. Happy to hear that. I was listening for that, and I thought I didn't hear it.
Hi.
If I could just add to Commissioner that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill, is also the 5-year reauthorization of all surface transportation programs. So federally, that would have been the opportunity to move away from the gas tax and to vehicle miles traveled or other mechanisms. That was partially done, but not completely. So the opportunity to do this again at the federal level is 5 years off. So no reason that we shouldn't keep advocating for it, but just as an FYI.
Sad, but thank you. Another missed opportunity, eh?
We'll keep trying. So finally, the last priority in the draft agenda is maintaining local authority and opposing preemption. The local authority is critical to the City of Portland's ability to respond nimbly and effectively to both local community and city operational needs. The City of Portland is actively seeking legislation to enable more flexibility during this declared emergency, and conversely opposes efforts to curtail its authority to develop and enforce local ordinances and voter-approved measures, manage its bureaus and their functions, and maintain and raise revenue consistent with the city's principles and values. So advocacy would include the ensuring local consent for the federal deputization of local law enforcement, protecting local authority to manage public right-of-way for telecom and broadband and cable services, establishing strong federal privacy protections for individuals and allow local regulation on the development of technology, protect local authority to regulate transportation network companies, automated vehicle companies, and e-scooters, maintaining local authority over chemical treatments for drinking water systems, and prioritizing the inventories of chlorine and caustic soda for the use for the water sector. So this concludes an overview of the draft 2022 federal legislative agenda, and we're happy to take any questions on what was reviewed on the slides or was in the document, or we can hand it over to the state relations team at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels. I believe that we have Stacy Cowan and Eric Knoll from the State Relations team up next.
Thank you, Bree. Good morning, Mayor, members of Council. My name is Stacy Cowan. I use she, her pronouns. I manage the State Government Relations Program for the City of Portland. Haley, can you move to the next slide, please? So setting the stage for our discussion today, here's the timeline for what our work is going to look like over the next 3.5 months. You'll see Friday, November 19th was the deadline for legislators to submit bills to be drafted for session. The work in Salem is going to begin January 11th with legislative organizational days, and we will be back before you on January 12th for acceptance of the state and federal agendas. And as was discussed earlier, we absolutely plan to hold our annual legislative breakfast. We will be holding it remotely again this year on January 27th. And then February 1st is the first official day of the legislative session. I will note for council that as of today, we do not yet have confirmation about the status of session being in person versus remote, or possibly a hybrid version. And it's largely due to the fact that the Capitol still has several public spaces under construction for seismic upgrades. You'll note that the legislature must conclude their work no later than March 7th, which is just a mere 35 days from the start of session. So truly a short session. Can I have the next slide, please? Next, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Eric Knoll, for an overview of legislative leadership.
Thank you, Stacy, and good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Eric Knoll. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the state lobbyist with the Office of Government Relations. Before we turn to look at key issues for the 2020 session and the draft state legislative agenda, Stacy and I will provide background on the current dynamics in Salem. And we'll start with an overview of the Oregon legislature. The balance of power between parties has not substantially changed since the last session, with the exception of a few notable changes in the Senate. Democrats hold majorities in both chambers, though not a 3/5 majority in the House necessary to approve revenue-raising bills without support from the minority party. Further, Democrats do not hold a quote-unquote quorum-proof majority in either chamber, which means denying quorum remains a tool available to the minority party in the short session. When our team last presented to Council in November 2020, the Senate was composed of 18 Democrats and 12 Republicans. Since that time, there are now 10 Republicans and 2 members of the Independent Caucus in the Senate, Senator Robinson of Cave Junction and Senator Boquist of Dallas. In late October, Senator Fred Girod of rural Marion County stepped down as Senate Republican leader, and Senator Tim Canope of Bend was elected by his caucus as the new Republican leader. Another notable change in the Senate was President Courtney's removal of Senator Johnson from her role as co-chair of the Joint Ways and Means Committee following her announcement to run for governor as a small I independent candidate. Senator Steiner Hayward remains as Senate co-chair of the legislature's Budget Committee, and Senator Johnson does remain on the committee as a co-chair of the Transportation Economic Development Subcommittee and is still an influential swing vote on the full committee. Following redistricting, there are members of the Senate Democratic leadership team that will hold or gain substantial shared constituency with the city of Portland. Assuming they are reelected to their seats in 2022, and as Dan mentioned earlier, Senate Majority Leader Wagner's Senate District 19 maintains a substantial population of Portland residents and now includes more of John's Landing in the South Waterfront as far north as the Ross Island Bridge. Deputy Majority Leader and Ways and Means Co-Chair Senator Steiner Hayward's District 17 will go from representing portions of the Pearl District in Northwest Portland to representing most of downtown Portland north of PSU, the Pearl District, Linton, and part of St. John's. And Assistant Majority Leader Kate Lieber's new Senate District 14 will include much of Southwest Portland, including Portland State University, Lair Hill, Multnomah Village, and Hillsdale. I will also note of significance to a priority in our legislative agenda that Senator Lieber also serves as co-chair of the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Human Services, which manages the budgets for the Oregon Health Authority and Department of Human Services, and was a key player in the major mental health package that the legislature passed in the prior session. On the House side, as you know, Speaker Kotek has filed to run for governor. House Republican leader Christine Drazen will also launch a bid for governor, and formal announcement is expected in the weeks ahead. Both are expected to remain in their legislative leadership positions in this short session, barring any further announcements. Stacey will cover additional points about 2022 short session dynamics later in the presentation. Now, the impacts of redistricting on the House side for the Portland delegation are less significant or notable than the Senate side, but there are a few notable changes. Again, with the caveat, this assumes each of the following members are re-elected in the 2022 cycle. On the west side of Portland, Representative Reynolds will relocate from the former House District 36, which encompassed the southern half of downtown Portland, to House District 34, the small portion of residents in Northwest Portland. In Southwest, Representative Graber will represent significantly more Portland residents than the new House District 28, which extends north to Portland State University. And in Southeast Portland, Representative Bynum will remain a member of the Portland delegation in House District 39, but will have significantly fewer residents in her district. And as we've also seen in media reports, Representative Bynum intends to seek the speakership following Speaker Kotek's tenure. As we look beyond the short session to the 2022 statewide election cycle and its implications for the 2023 legislature, we are likely to see significant turnover in both chambers, resulting from redistricting, members seeking other elected offices, and retirements. All 60 seats in the House will be up for election, and half of the Senate districts will be on the ballot, in addition to a very significant gubernatorial race. The point here is that the dynamics in the legislature will be very different in 2023, and a lot is uncertain at this point in time. Compared to the 2021 session, these changes will include, at a minimum, a new Speaker of the House, at least 15 new members in the House representing 25% of the chamber, including at least 3 new members of the Portland delegation, as well as at least 5 new members in the Senate representing 17% of that chamber, and including 1 new member of the Portland delegation as a result of redistricting. Now, our team will be back in front of you again next November ahead of the 2023 legislative session and following the November 8th general election to break down those election results and the implications for the 2023 session and our delegation moving forward. Next slide, please. Now, many changes have already occurred since the beginning of the year in the legislature. Notable appointments since the beginning of 2021 include the appointments of Senator Casey Jama in Southeast Portland to replace Shamia Fagan, who was elected Secretary of State in 2020. Representative Andrea Valderrama in Southeast Portland to fill the House District 47 vacancy created by the resignation of former Representative Diego Hernandez. Representative Anna Scharf of Dallas to fill the House District 23 vacancy near the end of the 2021 session following the expulsion of former Representative Mike Neerman from the House. And now Senator-designate Akasha Lawrence Spence, formerly Representative Lawrence Spence, selected yesterday afternoon in a joint meeting of Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas County Commissioners to fill the remainder of the term in Senate District 18, following the resignation of former Senator Jenny Burdick at the end of October. We also anticipate 3 additional appointments will be made prior to the 2022 session in House districts representing Kaiser and Salem respectively, and for Senate District 15 in Hillsborough. Next slide, please. Looking ahead to ballot measures, there will be at least 2 statewide measures on the ballot in fall 2022. These measures were both referred by the legislature in the last session. Senate Joint Resolution 12 is a constitutional amendment that was nicknamed Healthcare for All during the 2021 session deliberations. And SJR 10 is also a constitutional amendment that would remove a clause from the Oregon Constitution similar to the exception clause in the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution. And Portland City Council did submit written testimony during the session in support of SJR 10 to the legislature. Beyond legislative referrals, 41 initiative petitions have been filed for the 2022 ballot. Of those, 35 remain active, 6 have been approved for circulation. And to the conversation earlier about IP34, none have yet submitted signatures to qualify for the November 2022 ballot. For measures to qualify, the deadline to submit the necessary number of signatures is Friday, July 8th of 2022. For measures that amend state statute, a minimum of 112,000 signatures have to be submitted. And for initiatives that amend the state constitution, the minimum number of signatures is over 149,000. I'll now turn the presentation back to Stacy, who will review key city accomplishments from the 2021 session and turn to the work ahead in 2022, unless there are any questions.
Eric, I have one question. Why would the legislature send SJR 12 to voters?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. This was a resolution that's been proposed for multiple sessions now, and came out of the office of the late Representative Mitch Greenlick.
This is around healthcare for all.
Correct.
With Mitch Greenlick's baby. Yeah.
My understanding of the top line from that measure is to amend the state constitution to establish a right to healthcare in our state constitution.
We did that for education, and that didn't work so well. Right. So it may sound good, but in practice, it doesn't actually change anything, does it?
That's also a good question. I think that remains unclear at this point. Depending on the passage, and as a public employee, I will stop from speculating to whether it will be successful on the ballot. As we've seen, for example, in a state like Washington, measures that amend the state constitution in this nature may trigger legal challenges that set certain precedents that have broader implications for the state budget and policymaking. So it may not be the contents of the measure itself, but any sort of legal precedent that comes out of it that has the more significant impacts on our legislative process.
Yeah, I would be concerned about that because the legislature should be funding healthcare. So why aren't they? Why send it to the voters to change the Constitution if they have the power to actually fund it already? Right? That doesn't make sense to me. But I'll leave it there. Thanks, Eric.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Eric. Now, let me grab my notes here. So looking back at our last session and our session accomplishments, the city of Portland has a lot to celebrate coming out of this legislative session, including the successful passage of several city policy and budget priorities. This was especially gratifying given that it was the first ever fully remote full session, and we were a little unsure of what we were going into. I'd like to take a moment just to highlight a few examples of some of the successes that the city saw. First and foremost, $80 million for the safety improvements and the jurisdictional transfer of 82nd Avenue to the city of Portland. Senate Bill 204, which creates a pathway for civilian, community oversight, and review bodies to access information in Oregon's law enforcement data system. Senate Bill 398, which bans the display of a noose for the purposes of intimidation or harassment. Senate Bill 621, which removes barriers to successfully implement the voter-approved community police oversight board. House Bill 2456, which authorizes federal background checks for Revenue Division employees to achieve compliance with IRS guidelines. The bill also establishes flexibility in the HOLTE program. And House Bill 2530, which authorizes the continued use of fixed photo radar. House Bill 3055, which improves traffic safety by expanding local speed setting authority. And lastly, we worked really hard, and I should say Eric primarily takes the lead on this work, really diligently to ensure that there were no major preemptions enacted this session. Next slide, please. As we look ahead to the 2022 session, it's important to remember that as a short session, the legislature is limited by the Constitution to just 35 days. So 5 weeks as opposed to 5 months in a long session. Additionally, legislative leadership puts limits on the number of bills that can be introduced. So we're likely to see a universe of about 250 bills as opposed to about 2,500 in a long session. And short sessions traditionally deal with unfinished business, technical fixes, urgent items that need action before the next long session. Some of the themes that we expect to see in Salem this session include COVID-19 response and vaccination efforts, housing and workforce. And legislative leadership has indicated that they'd like to move policies on transforming justice, farm worker overtime, and universal representation, all of which are considered unfinished business from this last session. Now, in addition to the policies, I do think that it's important to recognize the political landscape that will undoubtedly have an impact on the legislative session. 2022 is going to see a gubernatorial campaign with what is shaping up to be an incredibly large field of candidates. As Eric mentioned, we have Speaker Kotek, Senator Johnson, and House Republican leader Drazen have either filed or indicated their intention to file for governor. Additionally, the end of the special session on redistricting in September was very contentious, and it's unclear how that might carry forward into session. As we've seen before in previous sessions, we could see additional walkouts. We could also see a requirement that bills be read in their entirety, which of course would further slow session down. I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Eric to briefly discuss the state budget landscape.
Before you do that, sorry, I didn't hit my hand raised fast enough. Commissioner Ryan, you actually did have your hand raised. You go first.
No, I just put it up, so go.
Oh, okay. So we keep touching on the very important governor's race, and then we keep moving away from it. Let's just be honest. The city of Portland, let me step back. California has 25 major cities. Those major cities are well organized. They meet regularly with the governor of their state. They have clout with the governor of their state, and they have clout with their legislature and legislative leadership around urban issues. Oregon is the opposite. Oregon only has one large metropolitan area, and it seems that everybody is perennially running against Portland and working honestly, sort of not always in the best interests of urban issues, particularly around some of the safety issues, the houselessness issues, and livability issues that we're experiencing. So we have this rare moment that's been noted a couple of times in this presentation about the first open gubernatorial election in 2 decades. I believe we with allies should have a very focused town hall and or debate and or something focused on the issues of this city and have an opportunity to really ask and compare and contrast the gubernatorial candidates on issues that are important to the city of Portland as the largest urban area in the center of economic gravity in the state of Oregon that is experiencing withering challenges. I can't just let this gubernatorial election go by and have everybody say, yeah, we don't want Portland's problems. That's not what we want for the state of Oregon, and have them run against us. I want to do a judo maneuver here and get ahead of this and ask for account from these candidates who seek to be the executive branch of our government on how they are going to specifically work with us and partner with us on housing issues, homelessness issues, livability, and safety issues. And I realize there is a state law that precludes city employees from engaging in politics, but I want us to find a way, and maybe it's just the elected officers, maybe it's the 5 of us, figure out a way to actually put our issues front and center in this gubernatorial election. This is an opportunity we cannot miss. And I say this, I don't think I'm going outside of the bounds of state law here. There are already candidates running against the city of Portland. They're not going to be very helpful to our agenda in Salem if that is the mindset that they are bringing to the table as the potential executive of the state of Oregon. What are your thoughts on that?
Mayor, thank you so much for those comments. I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate you recognizing that as public employees, I think there are different limitations placed on me and my office, as well as on and some different opportunities that might exist with the elected. So, but I absolutely agree that there is opportunity with the significant transition that we're going to see at the legislature, both at the legislative level with the leadership, as well as in the governor's office. And so I'd be happy to work with your office and again, figure out what appropriate work we could do, and then draw that line between the type of work that we could do to help build some of those relationships as we look ahead. And then, of course, your office can identify opportunities that might be more appropriate for the electeds to engage in, because there will be different sort of lanes that we can travel in. But I appreciate your comments, and I think you're absolutely right on track that there's a lot of opportunity here.
Yeah, I'd like us to put some thought into it. Again, I don't want to get our city employees in trouble. I just don't want to miss what's an obvious, important waypoint for our state agenda.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Commissioner Ryan?
Yes, thank you, Stacy. And I just wanted to make a couple comments and perhaps questions to make sure when we're looking at certain language, that we're implying some universal intention around it. So when you see housing, that's where you would also assume that that's where the houselessness focus would be. Is that correct?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I used a very general umbrella term when I'm just trying to identify some themes. On the next couple of slides, we'll go a little bit deeper into some of the recommendations that we have and some of the items that I think specifically the legislature will be addressing. Okay, then I'll be very brief here. And then when we get to workforce, our state safety net has been called out for all the right reasons, which kind of the mayor's point earlier, that we want to raise the safety net, behavioral health, mental health issues to influence this session, but also the gubernatorial race. And workforce issues, particularly in that area, are just really haunting right now. I mean, it's very grim when you talk to any of our providers on how difficult it is to hire anyone. And I know there's workforce issues all over, but I just wanted to make sure that we drilled into that a little bit and had clear consensus for that advocacy. Thanks. Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, we'll go a little bit deeper in the next slide, and then of course, welcome any comments or feedback you have from there. If there are no additional questions, I'd like to give Eric just an opportunity to give us a little bit of the lay of the land for budget bills this coming session.
Thank you, Stacy. The short session occurring halfway through the legislature's two-year budget cycle will likely include budget adjustments and other expenditures deemed timely by the Joint Ways and Means Committee. Following an unprecedented budget in the 2021 session, this session will likely include some form of an omnibus budget reconciliation bill. Further, the legislature will also likely move to approve additional expenditure limitation authority for some of the remaining federal funds the state received through the American Rescue Plan Act, and approve expenditure authority for agencies to receive and expend funds from the recently enacted Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And beyond truing up the state budget and agency programs and approving expenditure authority, the legislature also has additional surplus general fund revenue to consider. The two most recent state revenue forecasts, following the start of the 21-23 biennium on July 1st of this year, yielded a $1.5 billion addition to general fund resources available in the biennial budget, on trend with every forecast we've seen since the middle of the pandemic. However, despite the significant budget surplus available to the legislature, there are a few cautionary notes to be aware of. First, the legislature approved over $2 billion in one-time general fund and ARP expenditures in the 2021 session. These authorizations for spending expire at the end of the biennium, and continuation of these programs would represent new funding and new spending in the 2023 budget cycle. Second, there will be a strong desire to maintain substantial reserves as the state approaches that spending cliff and to hedge against another economic downturn in the near to mid future. Third, state agencies have struggled to scale up their operations and capacity quickly to meet the demand for the new programs they've been directed to implement. Fourth, as a result, there will be much greater scrutiny applied to spending proposals for new programs in this short session, more than we typically see in a 35-day session. And finally, and of course, election year dynamics will also play a significant role in budget decisions made by the legislature. And with that underpinning, in that background, I want to turn back to Stacy to start walking us through our recommendations for the draft 2022 state legislative agenda.
Thank you so much, Eric. Haley, can you advance it one more slide, please? So looking ahead to 2022, here is our recommendation for the state legislative agenda. As Bree mentioned, we've organized this to mirror council priorities, including houselessness and housing stability, community safety, economic recovery and prosperity. And in addition, we added climate and environmental justice and the perennial item of local authority. And you'll see as we go through this, that this really is a list of items that are a combination of urgent items, unfinished business, as well as items that we've been working on for 1, 2, or 3 sessions that will continue to be multi-session strategies. So beginning with houselessness and housing stability, we have safe harbor and repayment extension for rent assistance. So as a reminder, Senate Bill 278 from 2021 created a safe harbor provision for tenants who've applied for rent assistance. In Multnomah County, that was extended from the statewide 60 days to 90 days. The safe harbor provisions protect a tenant from being evicted while they're waiting for their rent assistance to be processed. Due to delays in getting that money out the door, we recommend support for an extension to the safe harbor that would protect renters while their application is being processed. Senate Bill 282 from 2021 established a timeline for the repayment of past due rent accrued between April 1 of 2020 and June 30th of 2021. Right now, renters have until February 28th of 2022 to pay all the past due rent. This item includes support for an extension of that deadline to August 31st of 2022. I think folks know that as we slowly move through COVID response to recovery and folks are getting back to work, we know that wages and housing costs are not aligned. Families are continuing to struggle to catch up on rent. Extending this deadline would give renters more time to pay that past due rent and, importantly, give rental assistance programs more time to distribute funds. It is important to note that there is a possibility that the governor will call a special session before the end of this year with a framework that would look to address these items and also look at a possible additional infusion of dollars for rent assistance. We, of course, will continue to support the governor calling a special session. We'll monitor those discussions closely, but it's our hope that this item might be addressed prior to session convening in February. Moving on to the second bullet, we have in response to the heat dome this year and the individuals that lost their lives due to heat exposure, 2 concepts are being proposed. The first is a renter's right to cool, which would remove barriers for renters to install portable cooling technologies. The second concept would address emergency air conditioning needs and expand targeted deployment of efficient heat pumps to environmental justice communities. This bill would also authorize the Public Utility Commission to direct utilities to address energy bill spikes due to heat waves and cold snaps. Moving on to the third bullet, the legislature made historic investments last session in behavioral health. However, as Commissioner Ryan noted, without intervention addressing workforce shortages, those investments will not lead to the outcomes that Oregonians desperately need. This item includes support for establishing a forgivable grant program for providers to recruit and retain behavioral health workforce, which we know has been plagued by low pay even before the pandemic. I believe that there will also be additional conversation for some longer term strategies. This would be something that could be implemented in the short term. Mayor?
Yeah, to that point, my staff has been toying with a couple of concepts here, and I know that they've had conversations with you and others in government relations about this. So we obviously support the near-term goal here, which is to focus on the workforce issue. But there should also be an option here that we should consider to really expand this item and advocate for fully funding the entire health improvement plan. So not just the near term, the advisory oversight group and the efforts around workforce, but also advocating for fully funding the 2020 through 2024 plan. That would include some additional areas that are not currently being funded by the plan. That could include mitigating impacts of institutional bias and improving quality of care for underrepresented groups. It could include addressing conditions that specifically cause adversity, trauma, and significant levels of stress to those who would otherwise be seeking care, continuing efforts to reduce stigma related to behavioral health and providing access to coordinated care and treatment. And of course, supporting economic drivers of health. That's identifying housing, transportation, living wage jobs, and other areas where the state could invest to potentially reduce upstream levels of mental health and substance abuse issues in the state of Oregon. And as you mentioned, increasing equitable access to preventative care. All these things align neatly with our desire to focus on intervention and prevention, both around housing and public safety. It also speaks to some of our equity goals that we've identified as the city council. And so I'd like to just stop here for a moment and get your thoughts on this, whether we should expand our advocacy to include full funding of the plan 2020 through 2024. What are your thoughts and advice to this council on that front?
Thank you for those comments, Mayor. I appreciate that. I absolutely think that there's an opportunity for us in our advocacy. I believe the bullet establishes support for ensuring that the investments that were just made are fully realized, but I would be happy to provide an amended bullet that would more broadly talk about fully funding the strategic plan. And I know the conversations that we've had is, while these incredible investments that were made last session are very important, we all know that it will take 5 or 10 years for these investments to be realized. And it's essential that we have a strategic plan and we know where we're going so that we can continue to make investments so we don't just see this sort of one-time effort. So I'd be happy to provide a revised bullet.
So let me ask the question slightly differently, and I
Sure.
appreciate that, Stacy. Thank you, and that would be helpful. Whatever you, and I know you're already working with some folks in my office to do that, but I'd like a little more detail. I keep looking for what the state's plan is. Yeah, we're near the bottom of the list. So let me try to just spit this out. I haven't had much coffee today. We're at the bottom of the list in terms of the provision of mental health and substance abuse treatment amongst states. And I assume that is on a per capita basis or some sort of a measurement of need, but there's different surveys out there, and Oregon never does particularly well. If we had a specific goal, let's say 5 years from now, we wanted to be in the middle of the pack by addressing some of the obvious gaps that currently exist in mental health delivery in the state of Oregon. What would it take? Who needs to do what? What investments would need to be made by the legislature? And what would that connectivity be with county and municipal government to get it done, to move us from dead last to average in 5 years, and then a 10-year plan to get us in the top 10? What would it take? And is this that plan? And if it is, why can't I see it? And maybe I'm just missing something here, but I'm looking for the plan. I'm looking for the steps to get to a certain goal, and I'm looking for who does what. Where is the accountability in this system? Who's responsible for getting us from last to the middle of the pack in 5 years? And I guess I just am continually confused, because every time I ask somebody at the state level, what's the plan, I get a different answer, or I get directed to a different report or a different legislative item or a different agenda. And I'm just looking for what's the plan? Where can I see it? Is this it?
I think that those are all very good questions. This is the identified state health improvement plan, I believe, that you're referencing. I think that there is work that our office can do working with Representatives Nose and Senator Lieber, who were the primary leaders around the investment this last legislative session. And as a part of their work, Mayor, I do think what was unique was it was the first time in the legislature that we had seen a public discussion about the importance of the system from prevention all the way to the state hospital. So at the risk of wading into an area that subject matter experts probably would be better equipped with, I think these are all important questions that I think we can go back to the legislators.
Let me gently push back on that.
Okay.
Our state has relied on public health experts for 40 years to get us to the bottom of the list. I think this requires political leadership. How can we sit here as a city council and not acknowledge the obvious connection between our failed mental health delivery system and the homeless crisis we're seeing on our streets? They're linked. They're directly related. There's causality. And so I'm trying to figure out, as the mayor of this city, working with my colleagues here on the council, how do we push to get an actual plan that has specific goals, that has specific investments, and assigns specific responsibility and accountability for accomplishing those goals? And it can't always just be saying we need to do better here, we need to do better here, we need to do better here. We need to do better in all of the above. We know that. But I've looked at this list for year after, and not to any way discount the amazing work some of our legislators are doing. You know, Representative Nose and others, great. But I've looked at this same list for all 15 years that I've been in public office, and I've seen very little change. And so now I want to know, what's the plan? Where's the urgency? How do we help craft it? How do we help move it? And this is our chance through our legislative agenda to do so.
That sounds like a great conversation to have at our legislative breakfast, because I agree with you. I agree that unless we can see the full picture of what the legislature's vision is, and honestly, I think it's an ideal question to ask them ahead of time so that they come to the breakfast really prepared to have that conversation. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I also know that I know how the legislature works. And so having our whole delegation in one room will be the great place to have that conversation. Good idea. Thank you, Commissioner. And I see Bree and Commissioner Ryan also have thoughts. So I'll stop now. I made my point.
I appreciate your point, Mayor, and a brilliant idea, Commissioner Hardesty, to have that be an agenda item for our upcoming legislative breakfast in January. I wanted to give kudos to Stacy and Eric and Haley and within my state team for the development of this agenda. One of the things that we're looking at is how we've been reactionary in the past in responding to long session versus short session agenda development. And one of the things that we're looking at moving forward is to model more of the federal agenda process for more of a 2-year long-term cycle. And so I think these are the things that we can add into a more strategic approach of agenda development that will last over sessions, that are not just being reactionary to what can we do within a short session, given the nature of what we're facing, but keep those perennial items in our advocacy efforts. So I appreciate the call to the question and the task ahead of us. And I appreciate our team for thinking strategically and long-term about how we can move over session from long to short. And I think that this is exactly the type of item that we would like to see as a continuation from a long session to a short session. So thank you, Mayor and Commissioner.
And Bree, I have one more question. For me, it seems like one of the things that I just lost my thought. It'll come back to me. It's what happens when you get old. You start talking and you forget what you're going to say.
You don't have to be old for that to happen.
I know what it was. It was actually around the cooling concepts. I am very grateful to hear that this proposal actually will address the increase in utility costs for low-income people who somebody may show up with an air conditioning, but actually not help them pay their utility bill. And so, but my question is really around what is the responsibility of the utility industries to actually reduce the cost as compared to us subsidizing private utilities. It's ridiculous in my mind that we pay for stuff that we know is like cost prohibitive for folks, right? So the third biggest cost is utility costs for poor folks. So just bringing them an air conditioner is not helpful unless you're paying the utility bill. I hope that the details will not actually be subsidizing utilities, but actually will be subsidizing community members so that they can afford the increased costs that this generous gift has provided them.
Thank you for that comment, Commissioner. I appreciate that. I'll look more into the details of the policy and happy to follow back up with your office, but that's noted. And then just back a point on the behavioral health. Mayor, thank you so much for those comments. I appreciate it. I think our office will work on a strategy to revise the bullet, as well as a strategy moving forward to look for opportunities to be bolder with a little bit more urgency, and of course, looking ahead in the longer term. So we'll follow back up with your office on that. I want to be thoughtful of time. We have 10 minutes left on the presentation, so I'm going to move forward. The next item is around support and funding and expansion of legal aid services, including immigration defense services to support immigrant communities, renters, and BIPOC Oregonians. This includes the Universal Representation Bill, which is unfinished business from the 2021 session. And it's our recommendation to continue engaging in this coalition to get this bill across the finish line. The final item in this category is supporting implementation and further investment in household stabilization programs. As the legislature continues to address the impacts of COVID-19 on households, we recommend continued support for programs to meet the needs of Portlanders beyond rent assistance, like digital equity and low-income ratepayer assistance. Under the heading of community safety, we have 3 items. The first is to allow for PBOT review of fixed photo radar violations. Currently, this review must be done by a sworn law enforcement individual. This policy change would allow more flexibility for local jurisdictions in reviewing fixed photo radar citations. And this is an important step for PBOT as they continue working towards the Vision Zero commitment to end traffic fatalities and serious injuries. The second item is support for transforming community justice. Advocates are reintroducing House Bill 2002 from last session. This was a big priority for Reimagine Oregon Coalition. The bill will have 3 main areas. The first is around limiting stops and arrest. The second will be around supervision, parole, and probation. And the third will provide some additional direction around justice reinvestments. So I'll just pull out a couple of the big items. The first would require an officer to notify a person that they have the right to decline a request to search, and to document if the person gives consent to search. And another piece is a non-working taillight, brake light, or expired tags would become a secondary offense rather than something an officer could pull someone over for. So you'll notice this is a slight variation on the conversation last time. And this was an attempt to get at some of the concerns that the law enforcement community had around this. So folks have been working really diligently to craft a bill that has the ability to move through session this time around. Moving forward to the third bullet, police accountability technical fixes. This item is intended to clarify the intent of House Bill 2928 from last session and to better define crowd control. Law enforcement stakeholders, including City of Portland, are working with the bill sponsor to draft a technical fix to the legislation to allow for the bill to be implemented as the legislature intended, which was to prevent the indiscriminate use of impact munitions. There were many bills around police accountability this last session, so this type of technical fix is not uncommon when you see that volume of bills on a particular topic in a given session.
So what is the technical fix necessary? Because it sounds like police were just confused. They didn't know how to do their job once this bill passed. What is the technical fix?
Commissioner, the technical fix will provide a better, there's 2 options that our attorneys are talking with legislative counsel on. So either providing a definition of crowd control or further defining what crowd control situations are not. And so it's just a matter of putting more language into the bill. And I'll note that our advocacy with other law enforcement officials includes the state police, League of Cities, Association of Counties, So this is an issue that had been identified by a number of law enforcement officials, including the individuals that helped craft the bill. It just didn't quite turn out how everyone expected it to. And it really just was the pace of session was moving very quickly. The bill was amended at the last moment. So again, it's working with the bill sponsor to ensure that the bill is very clear and reduces any ambiguity in the ability to implement the bill.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Eric to walk through the second half of the agenda.
Thanks, Stacy, and I'll move quickly so that we have time for additional questions and closing at the end. The third priority that we are recommending is focused on economic recovery and prosperity, and that the city will continue work from the 2021 session to advocate for resources and policies that promote an equitable recovery for workers, small businesses, and community and nonprofit organizations. And this includes continuing our work in coalition to advance the Equity Investment Act, to establish a grant fund from the state's cannabis tax dollars to invest in wealth building, economic stability, business development, and other programs that support multi-generational wealth building for communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs and cannabis criminalization. The fourth priority on climate and environmental justice recognizes that the city of Portland recognizes the critical need to invest in a swift transition to clean energy while reducing energy costs for low-income people and the most vulnerable individuals in our communities. The first policy recommended in this area is advancing legislation to improve seismic safety for the critical energy infrastructure hub. Senator Dembro is reintroducing a bill from the 2019 session that would require the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality to regulate fuel tanks the same way they already regulate buried tanks. And the second item in this priority is to continue our work with the Levee Ready Columbia Coalition to implement the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District, advancing a bill with technical fixes to enhance the implementation and speed of standing up the district and dissolving the 4 current drainage districts in the area for the purpose of managing the levee system along the Columbia River. And then the final priority focuses on protection and enhancing local authority. Local authority has been a perennial item in the city's agenda. As local government, our authority relative to the state government is unique to us as an entity that advocates to the state. While the city has focused proactive advocacy in the first 4 priorities of the agenda, this item directs how we evaluate and respond to the other bills introduced in the legislative session. As Stacy mentioned, we will see a universe of approximately 250 bills in the short session. Our team will work with Bureau subject matter experts and city attorneys to evaluate each piece of legislation to ensure that it doesn't have an adverse impact on the city and to ensure we are well positioned to implement each proposal. Specifically, the city will actively advocate against restrictions to local authority in a variety of policy areas to ensure that we maintain our ability to develop and enforce local ordinances and voter-approved measures, manage our bureaus and their functions, and raise local revenue. And with that, that concludes the summary of our recommended draft 2022 state legislative agenda, and I'll turn it back to Bree to facilitate additional questions in closing.
Thank you, Eric and Stacy. I appreciate your time today. We have a few minutes left for discussion and feedback from you all. So I want to reserve my closing comments and take the lead of council on timing here.
Bree, I did have one question around, is there something that should be on our legislative agenda supporting our Native communities? As I read about some of the issues that are happening around the state, especially with rich people trying to put up casinos that they're not calling casinos, are there ways that we can be supportive of our Native community members in this legislative agenda to ensure that we don't allow rich people to come in and circumvent the law and practices here in Oregon?
Thank you so much, Commissioner Hardesty, for that question. I'm going to say absolutely. There's always that is always at the top of my mind as a Native Indigenous person from Oregon. So thank you for posing that question, and we will work with the Tribal Relations team. We did hold our Tribal Nations Summit where we reached out to tribal leaders from Oregon and the region to discuss about what are issues impacting their sovereignty. And we do have follow-up meetings. And so this time period between now and January is where we will continue to seek that information and feedback. And we will work with the state team to look at ways that we can partner with our tribes or as other governments on how we can protect and enhance their sovereignty against those things that impact their ability to have their livelihood. So yes, absolutely, Commissioner. We will figure out a way to add that within the state agenda.
I thought that was a big missing piece, and I really think it's important that we, that we actually have it on our agenda. That we protect, Native nations' ability to self-govern, right? It just seems slippery what they were attempting to do, and it appears that now people are paying attention. But that's not the first or last time that's happened, and it just feels like it should be part of our agenda.
If I may, Commissioner, to the point too, I'd point you to the beginning of our legislative agenda. So in addition to our agenda being ground and guided by the city's core values, you'll notice we specifically identify support for tribal sovereignty. And I would just mention that aside from a specific policy that might be identified in the agenda, we use that as a guiding value in terms of how we do our work. And so I'm happy to talk further if you'd like to see a specific policy, but I would just say in addition to grounding our work in racial equity, supporting tribal sovereignty is an important component and cornerstone of how we guide our work.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Stacey. But as you know, we can say one thing and we can actually legislate something radically different. So I just want to make sure that our words are matching our actions. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Hardesty, and honor that you carry that in the work that you do, truly. And so given that we're at time, I would go ahead and give my closing remarks and hand it back over to the mayor, if that's okay. Again, thank you, Stacey and Eric, for the presentation that wrapped up today's important work session, as well as the entirety of the government relations team. Council, we will take your feedback from today's session, as well as do follow-up meetings with your respective offices and adjust as necessary. We are currently planning to be back in front of you in mid-January with final versions of both the federal and state agendas for your consideration and approval. Looking forward into 22, specific to the state session, organizational days, as Stacey mentioned, will be January 11th through the 13th. We will likely see bills for the state short session the last week in January. We will have our annual Portland Delegation legislative breakfast virtually again this year on Thursday, January 27th, 2022, bright and early at 7:30 a.m. And the short session officially begins on Monday, February 1st, and the constitutional signing day is March 7th. I want to again thank your offices and bureaus for the collaboration on the agendas as they carry our hopes and desires for a prosperous and equitable Portland. I appreciate all of you and your time today, and I look forward to 2022. And with that, I'll hand it back over to the mayor.
Yeah, thank you, Director Fraley. I want to express my appreciation to all of you, and Director Fraley, thank you and your team for really the incredible work you put into preparing this draft 2022 federal and state legislative agenda. I think we all appreciated the succinctness of your report. We covered a lot today. Obviously, as city leaders, our collaboration and our advocacy with legislative and congressional colleagues is critically important to addressing our priority areas. And our priority areas, of course, are based on the needs of people who live in our community. Bree et al., I look forward to the Office of Government Relations returning to council to present the agendas for approval in January. I would also just like us to be a little flexible. Things could change here. There's a lot going on with COVID. There's a lot going on with some other issues. So I'd at least like us to prepare for the possibility that we might have one more quick work session between now and then just to true things up if necessary. And Bree, I'll leave that up to you to work with council offices to determine whether that is necessary. But we might want to be flexible on this just to make sure that we have exactly the right legislative agendas in front of us come mid-January. So thank you, everybody. With that, we are adjourned. Have a great day.